Hello everyone, Tally and Farrell here from Board of It. Today we're back with another best games to play at 2 players that are not specifically designed for 2 players video. We made the original in this series back at the start of the year, and by the end of the first day it was already our most viewed video by far, so we thought we'd give the people what they want and make another.
And if you didn't see that video, the reason for doing it, and this one, is essentially that it's very easy to find a good list of games designed for 2 players. Much harder to figure out if a game that you have your eye on is good at 2 players if it's designed with a player range of 2 to 4 to 6 to 8. So essentially we're going to go through the games, we're going to explain them in case you haven't heard of them or don't know much about them. Then we're going to say why they're great at 2 players, and then we're going to say how they would change if you played with more.
It's also important to note that the games are in no particular order, and their presence on this list and not the original one doesn't mean anything. Some of the games are just new to us, like Kanban EV, Quacks and Beyond the Sun. Some we already loved but never had the chance to play at 2 players, like Barrage. And some we did want to include on the original list, but we had to cut them simply due to time.
And many of these games we've reviewed, and there'll be links to those down below if you want to know more after watching this video. And we've also timestamped the video, so you can jump around to see what games you're interested in. And finally, it would really mean a lot to us if this is helpful to you in any way or you enjoy our content, if you could subscribe. And please feel free to ask us any questions about the games below or give us your own suggestions. So our first game is, you could say, your choice or the people's pick, because this is a game that on our first video, everyone commented saying, what about this? Or just had a go at us for not including it. But at the time, it was on our shelf of shame, and it is Castles of Burgundy. And we essentially played this pretty much for this video, and I actually hate the game because Tally has consistently beat me at it. So I will let her tell you why it's so great at 2.
Castles of Burgundy is a dice worker placement game where the goal is to complete your duchy with hex tiles to score big points. You'll use the dice to take tiles and to also lay tiles onto your duchy. With a huge variety of tiles and also sub-tiles, this is a really classic OG board game that is still a lot of fun in this day.
And weirdly, this is actually a game we prefer at 2 players, at least compared to 3 players, because when you play 2 or 3, you play on the same side of the board. And if you play at 3, what tends to happen is that by the 4th and 5th round of a phase, the central marketplace where you take hexes from tends to be really emptied out, and there might not even be anything there. And then you kind of get stuck in a holding pattern. Whereas at 2 players, even if the things there are suboptimal, you still have choices, which means that for us, when we played at 2, it was just a bit more engaging and vibrant.
The only player interaction is that other players will take tiles before you can get there. So the game doesn't really suffer from less player interaction at 2 players. So here we have a very classic board game that is great at 2 and definitely deserves to be on your shelf. And Farrell doesn't really hate it. He's just very bitter and salty because I am the Castles of Burgundy queen.
I will probably rate it about 6 points higher once I win.
Yeah.
And now we are going to talk about one of my favourite games. It's definitely top 5, probably top 3. It is Barrage. Barrage is set in an alternate 1920s where fossil fuels have been used up and hydroelectricity is our only way to produce power. This sets up a brutal, wildly interactive game where you fight for space in the Alps. You try to build your dams, you try to make use of the limited water that flows down and produce hydroelectricity for your own country.
At its core, it's worker placement alongside some very harsh resource management. But your main focus is going to be on the board where you'll be building structures. We actually played this for the very first time with 2 players very recently, and we're pleased to find it's just as fun and just as stressful at 2 players than it is at 4. The main difference is that you have more space on the map to build, so both of you can focus on your own systems with little to no interaction if that's what you want to do. Also, the worker placement spaces are capped in a 2-player game, so some spaces are completely unavailable, so that tight race and the battle to get to the space that you want first is still there. The general feeling of the game remains the same, and actually it's probably better at 2 players if you're the type of people that want something competitive but not brutally so. We do have a full review of Barrage, which we'll link in the description box below.
And I can attest to it still being just as stressful and brutal, because I'm pretty sure I nearly threw the box away when you beat me the first time we did 2-player.
Oh, it's my best game of Barrage, was it too? Because I actually beat Farrell.
It was so stressful.
So, next up we have Kanban EV, a game by master designer Vital Lacerda, which has quickly become my favourite game. In Kanban EV, you'll take on the role of a rookie worker in an electronic automotive factory where you'll have to work efficiently to impress your super mean manager, Sandra. You'll be designing cars, upgrading their parts and testing them on the track. It's a big, heavy Euro, but it's actually not too bad once you get into it. And it's also got some really cool twists on the classic Euro formula, which make it stand above other Euro games. We've actually mostly played this at 2, but also a few times with 3 players.
And the feel doesn't change too much. With more players, you might have to take a knee and take the weaker department spaces more often than you'd like. But aside from that, it mainly comes down to having to be a bit more reactive if you play with 3 or 4, because it's just more players taking things you want, pushing cars out on the assembly line, taking cars you want. So you can't strategize as well. But that's kind of good, because then it means that 2 players, you get to strategize more. And the interactivity isn't lessened, because, you know, if you look at a training track and there's 3 people ahead of you or 1 person ahead of you, your bad situation doesn't change. Sandra's still going to come and mess you up when she gets to that department. So the other thing actually with Sandra is that when you play a 2-player game, players can't move into the department where she is. So that means there's also less worker placement spaces, which would be more in line with playing with more players. So that feel of that battle for worker placement doesn't change either. So Kanban, really terrific game. And if you want to know more in depth about it, we've got a review and a playthrough, both linked down below. And now another one of Tally's new favourites, the Quacks of Quedlinburg.
Woo!
This is a bag building, push your luck game, great for anyone of any age, and it plays almost like a party game. In Quacks of Quedlinburg, you'll be trying to make the best potion out of anyone around the table by drawing chips from your bag and placing them in your cauldron. Each chip may have a different value or do something different entirely, but you don't want to draw too many cherry bombs, because if you do, your potion will explode and the game is going to suck for you.
Yeah, that is not ideal. Each round, you will hopefully be able to buy better and more exciting chips to then, again, hopefully be able to do even better in the following rounds. This is a quick-paced, uber-fun, addictive game. However, it is a solo endeavour somewhat, because none of the other players can impact what's in your bag or what's in your cauldron except for you. How the game plays at 2 players is the same as it is at 4 players. The reason why this has become one of my new favourites is because I think it's a really nice addition to our collection to have this kind of push your luck style game, as opposed to some of the more heavier strategy games. And I like getting this out after a long gaming session that's, you know, been quite hard on the brain. And this is just lighter, and to be honest, it's just super fun. So because of all of this, it's a very easy recommendation for us to make to play at 2 players. And if you're interested in how the game plays, we did film a playthrough video, which we'll link in the description box down below. So next up, we have Beyond the Sun. So this is a bit of a weird one, as if you watched our review of it, you'll know that we weren't exactly blown away by this game. Beyond the Sun is a worker placement, tech tree, colonising space game. It was very highly regarded when it first came out at the end of last year, with many prominent reviewers singing its praises and pipping it to be one of their games of the year. Because of this, and because it is genuinely a great game to play at 2 players, we've included it. And we do believe that other people will love this game even if we didn't. To find out more about our issues with it, check out our review.
In Beyond the Sun, you'll put your stamp on the future of humanity by researching technology and colonising far-flung star systems. It's a terrific worker placement resource management puzzle, but because it's not that interactive, it just doesn't really change if you play at 2 players or at 4 players. You see, once you start researching technology, there's enough worker placement spaces for everyone to be doing what they want, or at least doing something interesting. Plus, the colonization aspect, which is the other main arm of the game, there's at least 1 planet per player for everyone to colonize. So even though you can battle over them and kind of steal them away from other players, there's just not much point. And the main difference, you could say, would be that technology with more players is going to be researched quicker. So more people have an impact on how the technology tree branches out. But even at 2 players, you end the game with very few uncovered tech spaces left. So the overall outcome isn't that different. But essentially, if you are interested in Beyond the Sun, you don't have to worry because it is a very good game at 2 players.
So, next up, and to bring the complexity down a notch, we have Everdell. In Everdell, the popular worker placement tableau builder, you'll be creating a critter city by populating it with cards that represent animals and buildings. But not only is Everdell super fun, it also has amazing table presence with the wonderful 3D Evertree and excellent components.
So, why 2 players? Well, like a lot of worker placement games, the number of worker placement spaces is limited depending on the number of players. So you don't lose any of the tightness, no matter what player count you have. Secondly, these worker placement spaces are only really used to kind of give your engine a push. You generally go there at the start of a round to gather a few resources, and then with these starting resources, you invest them in cards, which then give you resources back, which then you invest into more cards until you have a self-perpetuating city.
Because of this, much of Everdell is played in your own player area. There are actually very few ways that players interact with each other. In higher player count games, the meadow, which is the central pool of cards, is more likely to change quickly, so it can be harder to nab the cards you want from there, but that's about it. Also, the cards are not unique in any way, and often there are multiples available of the same. And it's not the only way to draw cards, there's also a deck, so it's really not that much of an issue.
And we have a review, and so if you want to know more in detail, you can check out that, and we even have some upgraded dog meeples that we show off in that video. Continuing with our theme of light but engaging games that have great table presence, we have Wingspan. And this is also in some ways a people's choice because this was heavily recommended for our previous video as people's suggestion.
In Wingspan, the wildly popular card-driven engine builder by Elizabeth Hargrave, you'll be aiming to lure birds into your nature reserve, and then once you've trapped them, make them work for you to lure more unsuspecting birds into your nature reserve until it's bursting at the seams. Then you make them lay eggs. Lots of eggs. What a sick and twisted game.
It's a lovely game to play at 2 players. And this is because the main way that you interact with the game is through the random drawing of cards and the rolling of dice in the bird feeder rather than with other players. And if you're going to interact with other players, there's only 3 ways and they're all indirect. You know, you kind of have a shared bird feeder of food that you can take. You have certain cards that can be taken by any player, which are face up. And those are obviously very indirect ways to interact. And finally, you have bird powers, which will affect other players.
So yeah, at higher player counts, it is more likely that interactive bird powers are going to occur. But the main gameplay difference is that you'll end up with more food. So that isn't worth only playing this game at higher player counts because the effect is negligible. The benefit of playing this at 2 as well is that it's then a light and snappy experience as opposed to playing with 5 people, which can actually become a bit of a long slog. So honestly, we actually prefer playing Wingspan at 2 to 3 players as opposed to 4 or 5.
Yeah, and just also as a final note, because it's like an engine builder game, you're playing kind of solo on your own mat and, you know, putting your cards down, spending your food. So no one else really comes into that. But we also have a review of Wingspan if you would like to check that out.
So next up, we have another Vital Lacerda game on Mars, and we generally think his games are really good at 2 players. Now, it's the most complex one on the list and probably in our collection. It's a real sandbox of a game with the aim of colonising Mars. It's beautiful to look at, has engaging, expansive gameplay, and it's definitely going to fry your brain the first 2 or 3 times you play it.
Now, this is a game that we've mostly played at 2, and then because of that, you know that it's great to play at 2, or else we wouldn't keep playing it over and over. But it is one that will change a little bit at higher player counts. You know, just as an example, one main aspect of the game will be kind of colonizing Mars, building these little buildings. And you have all different types, one that produce plants, ones that produce oxygen, energy, and so on. And what tends to happen in a 2-player game is, say if there's 6 of them, 3 will be taken by Tally and focused on by Tally, and the other 3 will be taken by me, focused on by me. So I'll be building the greenhouses and the water producing plants. She'll be producing energy. And it's just because it's an easier way to go about it. But obviously with more players, you have more diversification. Now there's 4 players and 6. So then it becomes much more of a fight. And this diversification comes into play later.
The game will also be a little quicker, but we don't mean in terms of the playtime. More players will mean more buildings, so the life support system is going to be moving up higher, quicker. And the higher it moves up, the quicker the end of the game is going to come about. On the other hand, because you can use other players' technologies, you're never blocked out of building something that you want. Space and resources are also more of an issue at higher player counts, so you could say the game is more tense and competitive.
Yeah, and at 2 players on Mars is a very thinky, slower pace, but not in a bad way, kind of strategic Euro engine builder type game. And much like what we were saying when we talked about Barrage earlier in this video, it's essentially has the exact same feel of the game. It's just that it becomes a bit more strategic and you don't have to play as reactively as you do at 4 players. You probably will find it slightly easier to go down routes of the game that interest you rather than being forced down something because nobody else has done it. Essentially, the bottom line is we really enjoy playing this at 2 players. It's great at 4 players, and you know there might be some slight differences of these type of games that it just, I don't know, you could say pops a bit more at 4, but I think there's actually a lot to be said about playing this at 2 as well. So on Mars, and we also have a review of this. Next up, we have Vindication. In Vindication, you will be a wretched scumbag washed up on an unknown shore whose only goal is to vindicate yourself. In terms of the main gameplay loop, this is a Euro-type cube conversion game where on your turn you're going to activate places and characters to get cubes, which you'll then invest in companions who will get you more cubes, or you could combine 2 types of cube to get a better cube to get better things. And although this does sound really boring, actually, due to the way Vindication works and all the different things you can do, there's actually a lot of variability and replayability here.
Yeah, it's actually a very interesting one because a lot of it is card-based and all the cards do different things. So game to game, you're going to have different experiences. So in one game, you could focus on fighting monsters to get a lot of end game VP, whereas in another, you could focus on getting yourself traits, so you get a boon every time you do certain actions. But moving on to the 2-player aspect, it's just generally a fun game to play at 2 players. It moves quicker, and being a Euro game, the player interaction is limited. So we really don't think that the gameplay suffers itself by only having 2 players.
Yeah, so at higher player counts, there's 2 things I want to illustrate that will become more prominent. And one is that at the end of the game, a lot of endgame VPs are up for grabs for the player who has the most cards of each colour. And obviously with 2 players, either me or Tally is going to have the most blue cards and the most green cards and so on. Whereas with more players, I think this goes up to 5 around the table, you're going to have a lot more competition, and that fight's going to be a lot more tense for those endgame VPs, because you'll likely have 2 or 3 people who have as many blue cards as you do. And the other thing is that there's this small area control aspect of the game where you can put cubes of a certain kind on buildings you visit, and then when someone else goes to visit them, they have to, you gain VP, and then you'll gain VP at the end as well, if your cube is still there. And with more players, there's going to be more cubes, and it's going to be more of a mechanic or an issue. But both of these things are still present at 2 players, so it's not like you're missing out.
Final thoughts. This is really a game we do enjoy playing at 2 players, and we don't believe that compared with higher player counts, you lose much in any way. The box also comes with a lot of content, so if it's a game that you enjoy playing, then likely you're not going to get tired of it. So next up we have Renature, a dominoes game where you'll be aiming to repopulate polluted areas with trees and animals. The main aim is to have the most tree points, for lack of a better term, in an enclosed area to score VPs. The bigger the trees, the more they're worth, and to lay a tree, you have to lay a domino next to the enclosure where you want to plant it. This is a really wonderful, surprisingly competitive game with excellent components. The dominoes are weighty and the wooden components are big and chunky.
Now, this, more than probably any other game on this list, is actually quite different if you play it at 2 or if you play it at 4. Because at 2, you basically get double the amount of trees, double the amount of dominoes. There's obviously more space on the board, which stays the same no matter how many players. And at more players, because you get less of everything, it becomes much more tactical, much more building combos off other players and what they've laid. And everything you do really counts because you have so few trees to work with. The 2-player game is a bit slower, more kind of meandering. You have more control of the board, you can strategize a bit more, and you just generally get more time to work in it because you have to lay tiles together all the way down to the bottom of the board where the big money enclosures are. But I think the thing is that it's actually great at both player counts. I really like the 2-player game where you can strategize better and just kind of spend a bit more time on it. It's a bit more relaxing, at least in the laying, if not the playing of the game, because it's quite brutal. But at 4 players, obviously, if you want a brutal experience, tactical experience, it's great for that. So essentially, the end thing is a great game for if you're going to play with 2 and 4. Great if you're just going to play it at 2. But definitely a recommendation from us. It's a really beautiful game, really fun game.
And I guess it depends how brutal you want to be with each other, right? In a 2-player, you could leave each other alone, or you can smash each other like we enjoy to do.
Lastly, we have a relatively new game that we've been enjoying the last week or so. It is Merv. In Merv, you'll be trying to gain influence, prestige, and wealth in the ancient city of Merv, but you'll likely have to give some of that wealth up because the city is constantly attacked by Mongols.
Merv is a really cool, interesting, fresh take on worker placement. It's a real sandbox with a lot of actions that you can take that all interlink with one another in surprising ways. 2 players can play a game and be doing completely different things, but end up on the scoring track pretty close. It's a really thinky, AP-inducing strategic game that almost feels like a Vital Lacerda, but is more accessible.
Now, if you want to play it too, you do have to use a variant, where there's essentially a third player, if you will, a third meeple. But it's actually something that, I think this is going to be a variant that will probably divide people. Some will hate it, some will love it. We quite like it because it adds another strategical consideration to the game in that you can essentially weaponize the meeple because one of you gets to choose what work placement slot it goes to. The other gets to choose what building site it activates. So essentially I can put it where Tally clearly wants to go that turn and stop her from having a really good turn. But then she gets to pick where its building goes. And then she can put it in basically a row or a column that I'm heavily working on, making that row or column worth a little less to me.
However, we do just want to say, for full transparency, we've really been loving this game at 2 players, but we actually haven't managed to play it at higher player counts yet. Hopefully we will soon. We'll be forcing this on our friends. So, and we have heard other people say that it's perhaps more interesting at 4 players. So that's something to consider. In a similar way to Dune Imperium, which also has a variant that you have to use if you want to play with 2 players, it does manage to capture the essence of Merv. Bottom line is, even though it might be more interesting to play with 4 players, it's a game we really love to play with just 2 of us and something that we're going to be getting out time and time again. So you don't have to worry that you will only ever be able to play at higher player counts, such as a game like Root.
So that's our second list of games that are great at 2 players, but not specifically for 2 players. And we'd just like to say thanks for watching. And just as a side note, some games that we like specifically for 2 players.
Honourable mentions go to Polis, which we've really been enjoying.
Really enjoying.
Lately.
The new version.
Yeah. And
Making a President.
the
1960.
1960 Making a President. So good.
I really am into that theme in that game. It's incredible 2-player battle.
Yeah.
Much like Twilight Struggle or Imperial Struggle, but a bit quicker, a bit snappier.
Definitely my favourite of those kind of dual tug-of-war games.
I think the theme does a lot there. It's just quite interesting if you're not into 1600s, 1700s history.
Yeah, perhaps we'll do a video on our favourite dual tug-of-war games.
Yes.
Soon.
But those are both great. And we have the previous video of the best 2-player games, not specifically for 2 players, if you haven't seen that. And we would just finally like to say that if you enjoyed this, if it was helpful, it would mean a lot if you could subscribe to us, like this video, and also please comment with your own suggestions. We'd love to know more examples, obviously always on the lookout for new games. But thanks for watching, and hopefully we will see you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good.